Mozart famously was a child prodigy, so he followed his father into the family business. Both he and his sister were performing and composing from an incredibly young age, and in a way his whole life then was mapped out by that. He was of course an incredible talent. He toured Europe from a very, very young age, and his fame spread very quickly, even when they were both children. So in a way his career was predetermined almost from birth. The biggest influence on Mozart's early life was undoubtedly his father, who not only taught him but paved the way for most of his important jobs, and indeed was instrumental in making sure that the commission for Seraglio came his way. Mozart was in his mid-20s when he wrote Seraglio, so in a way he was just coming into the fullness of his powers. He'd written Idomeneo a couple of years earlier and was now ready to take Vienna by musical storm. Hanging over all of Seraglio is the very vexed question of Europe's relationship with Turkey. Turkey had imprinted itself on the imaginations of the Viennese going back centuries. Constantinople had fallen to Turkey back in 1453, and that brought the real threat of a Muslim power into Europe. 100 years before Seraglio was written, Vienna had come within days of falling to the Turkish power, and the siege of Vienna became a powerful image in the Viennese imagination for the genuine threat that this power held, always on the edges of Europe and ruling over many of the Balkan neighbours. In the 100 years after the siege of Vienna, before Seraglio was written, that threat gradually receded, and instead of a power that really threatened the well-being of Europe, Turkey became instead a symbol of the exotic and perfumed East, a place of luxury, a place of bejeweled magnificence, but also a society totally different from Europe. It was a place where polygamy existed, and also where the enslavement of Europeans was viewed with the same degree of acceptance that Europeans viewed the slavery and the enslavement of Africans and Asians. So for Mozart then, it can become a very, very powerful mirror reflecting European prejudices back on themselves. The genesis of Seraglio goes back to the Emperor Joseph's attempt to create a genuine vernacular theatre for Germans. He had redesignated one of the city's theatres as a national theatre, and he wanted to create an art form that mixed the best of opera with much less pretentious comic drama. It's worth remembering that for 2 generations before Seraglio was written, all opera in both Germany and England had been Italian, and that was coming to seem an anachronism. So Joseph II had set out to create a national theatre in German for Germans that mixed the very, very best of Italian opera with something a little bit less pretentious, something in their own language and something with spoken dialogue instead of recitative. Now, what's important about Mozart's opera, The Abduction from the Seraglio, is that he sets out not simply to create a comic opera in the folk style, but to mix the very, very best of the high Italian style with something less pretentious, more folksy, more comic in German. But at the same time, he also integrates the idea of serious spoken drama. So he's in effect blending not 1, not 2, but 3 different art forms: the Italian opera seria, German serious spoken drama, and comic musical theatre. And he does this by weaving together the plots in such a way that we have the very, very best of all 3. Now, famously, it seemed to be a little bit too much for the Viennese at the time. The emperor remarked that it was too perfumed, too exotic for Viennese tastes, and there were many notes. Now, that anecdote is probably inauthentic. We don't have a record of it during Mozart's lifetime, but it does embody something that's very true about the piece. It does absolutely ask a huge amount of audience and performers, because you have a serious drama and a comic drama going on at the same time, and also proper spoken theatre. Mozart responded to this by making some very, very clever and tasteful cuts, which just slimmed down some of the musical sections and brought it well within the attention span of his audience. The spoken drama is also a very, very important part of it. It was based on an existing play somewhat hastily cut down for Mozart's purposes, but there is a fully formed poetic drama, particularly between Constanza and the Pasha, that plays out in the midst of all of this music. So Mozart is bringing three separate elements together to fuse something really new. And of course, he creates a singspiel tradition that goes on to be the basis of what Beethoven would create in Fidelio. In Germany, Weber would take it in a much darker direction with Der Freischütz, but also it lives again all the way into the 20th century, and of course ties in with the other opera this season, Silbersee, which has a reasonable claim to being one of the last great versions of that form. Seraglio was in many ways an experimental first attempt to create something that blended the best of Italian opera with an unpretentious vernacular tradition. After he completed it, Mozart followed his commissions in very different directions, and we have the Italian operas from the Da Ponte trilogy and the very much more old-fashioned in its dramatic structure, Clemenza di Tito. The next work that follows this tradition and takes it in many ways to its greatest fulfillment is the Magic Flute. And there he was also able to bring the very, very best of an Italian operatic tradition to bear on a story that also incorporated genuine vernacular folk idioms. And we see lots of forward-looking moments in Seraglio that begin to open up questions that he would then answer in Magic Flute. And the Pasha, in many ways, is a precursor for Zoroastro, a figure who seems at first sight to be an authoritarian, overbearing, draconian character, and we discover as the evening goes through something much more complex, and we realise that our prejudices about him have led us to misunderstand a character who is in fact far more complicated. The journey of Tamino in the Magic Flute from naivety to maturity and enlightenment is also prefigured here in Belmonte's journey from washing up on the shores of Turkey, assuming his own cultural superiority and his own values to be far in advance of those of his enemies, and finding out little by little that he has a great deal to learn. The legacy of Mozart combining the best of serious theatre with a vernacular tradition is seen first of all in the next generation in Beethoven, taking it to an entirely more serious level in Fidelio, and then his successors took the singspiel tradition into much darker psychological places, and we think of Weber's Der Freischütz. Mozart then went out of fashion for a good 100 years, so we see his influence resurface then in the 20th century, where of course he was a profound influence on Kurt Weill and his idea of theatre, and of a whole generation of composers then. Mozart was also a phenomenal influence on Rossini and that Italian bel canto tradition. He was also an influence on Wagner, who edited his works and who saw in Mozart someone who was able to combine all the best of the theatrical elements to create something that was more than the sum of its parts. If you enjoy Seraglio, you are going to enjoy all of Mozart's works. His other operas are the greatest pieces of art ever to see life on a stage. The Da Ponte trilogy, The Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni and Così fan tutte are profound insights into human relationships with some of the most sublime music ever written. The Magic Flute takes many of the philosophical questions raised in Seraglio and takes them to an even greater and more profound level with the same witty, beautifully crafted melodies and tunes, and we see what the art form could have been raised towards.